Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the NOAA Central Library. I'm Katie, your librarian host. The library's seminar program provides an educational forum for the presentation of ideas, research updates, and news in support of NOAA's mission. I'm excited to invite the Office of, I'm going to blank on this again, Jennifer, I did it before, on the performance. I'm going to say this.
Performance, Risk, and Social Science Office,
Performance,
PRSSO.
Risk, and Social Science Office. I will get that one of these days. We do have 2 more seminars coming up that I can practice on. So I'm super excited to be hosting today's seminar. But a few logistics first. Please note this presentation is being recorded and your name, email, and any questions you ask on the webinar will be shared with the presenter after the fact. As an attendee, you are muted, so please place all your questions in the question panel. Questions will be asked at the end of the presentation. If you have technical issues such as no audio or no visuals, please try logging off and back on, as that solves most issues. I say most, so sometimes this does not work, and I can try and work with you to troubleshoot the continued issue. I will note there is no chat feature on here, so everything has to go through the question panel. If you do want something to be communicated to the whole audience, some comment you would like to make, please put that in the question panel and I can share that with the whole audience. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to do the introduction of our speaker today. Take it away, Jennifer.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar on input-output modeling tools. I'm Jennifer Zhuang. I'm an economist with the Performance, Risk, and the Social Science Office, which is also called PRSSO. Today's webinar is the third part of the Economic Input-Output Modeling Seminar Series that the PRSSO is organizing. These seminars will provide the opportunities for NOAA social scientists and policy analysts to learn about the concepts, available models, best practice, and caveats of this topic. There will be more seminars coming up in October on IMPLAN and REMI demos and some case studies, so stay tuned. Today's webinar will walk through a series of questions to help economists, project managers, and other folks to understand how input-output analysis and tools can best be used to help inform decision-making. The questions discussed today include what economic impact and contribution analysis are, how is it different from benefit cost analysis, how do we communicate and frame the results, what tools do we have to perform this type of analysis, and when should we use each tool? The speaker today is Charles Goodhue. He is a senior economist and project management professional with the Eastern Research Group. Over the past 15 years, he has led over 50 economic analyses related to the marine economy or resilience for clients who included NOAA, FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, NIST Community Resilience Group, and state and local governments. He has incorporated input-output modeling into a number of these projects, bringing experience using IO models such as REMI, IMPLAN, and BA's RIMS multipliers. With that, I'll turn it over to Charles.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the introduction, and Katie for kicking things off. Pleasure to be here today and take up some of your time this afternoon. So just a quick agenda, just to reiterate some of what Jennifer said. We'll quickly discuss why are we here, talk a little bit about economic analyses. What is economic impact and contribution analyses? How does this differ from benefit cost analyses? And really talk about the focus on input-output tools and some of those questions that Jennifer just went through. And we'll leave some time at the end to go through some examples of projects that have used these different input-output tools, as well as some time for questions and discussion. So today we're here to explore the following questions. What is an economic impact and contribution analysis? How is it different from benefit cost analysis? How do we communicate and frame the results? What tools might you have to perform this type of analysis, and when might you use each tool? This is not intended to be a tutorial about how to use each IO tool or model. Rather, this is to help economists, project managers, contract managers, kind of whoever's in those decision-making roles, understand when it might be appropriate to use input-output modeling, and specifically what tools might be appropriate. So starting with a few definitions, economic activity analyses are sort of a broader term that might include economic impacts and economic contributions, and these overlap quite substantially with some smaller nuanced differences. On the economic impact side, this is the net change in new economic activity associated with an industry, event, or policy in an existing regional economy. Sometimes in layman's terms, we try to refer to this as it wouldn't be there otherwise. If your investment wasn't there, we would not have this economic impact. So it's a little bit of a stronger definition, a little narrower definition than contribution. Economic contribution is the gross change in economic activity associated with an industry, event, or policy in an existing regional economy. So these might be sort of dollars, jobs, impacts that are associated with this event, industry, or policy. We'll go over some more explicit examples in the next slide to hopefully make these definitions set in and become a little more concrete. I'm also going to note that input-output, or IO models, are used to perform either of these types of analyses in very much identical ways. You're just changing the scope of what you're looking at a little bit and how you're framing that question. I also just note that I bold regional here because the economic activity in these analyses are always relative to a selection of a region. This is often a county, group of counties, states, maybe group of counties across states. It could be a few states. So you're really looking at whatever that region is that's being studied. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the very end of the presentation today, that selection of a study region. So let's go through a more concrete example to sort of see that difference between impact and contribution. If we think about an entity or agency that protects natural resources, just as an example, something that might have visitation. Two examples within NOAA that could be good here, the National Estuarine Research Reserves or the National Marine Sanctuaries. And again, there's many others. But in those examples, we can think of the difference between economic contribution and economic impact in the following way. So for both examples, we have operations spending. This is the money on salaries of the people who work there, as well as the money for equipment, rent, other expenses. This is sort of in that bucket of spending that would not otherwise occur in the absence of the reserve or sanctuary, and thus is in that economic impact smaller circle on the right of the screen. It gets a little bit trickier with visitor spending. This kind of splits into both of those bins of economic contribution and economic impact. So part of this is more clearly and more often in the economic impact bin. When we're talking about visitor spending from out of the state or out of the region of the analysis, this is often spending that would not have occurred within the region we're looking at in the absence of that reserve or sanctuary in many instances, or at least by and large. But what about the folks that are spending money that live inside the region of analysis? and this is where it gets, again, a bit more nuanced. While all the spending they do related to visiting that reserve or sanctuary or other entity is an economic contribution. It's associated with that reserve or sanctuary. But is it an economic impact? Well, it is only technically an impact if they would have spent the money outside the region otherwise. So essentially this goes into a very tricky measure because some people might spend their money otherwise within the region on something else. Maybe they would go to a movie, maybe they go mini golfing, while others may look for a similar experience outside the region. So maybe instead of going to the sanctuary in their area they live in, they would go to a very similar experience outside the region. So in truth, that sanctuary or reserve is keeping money in the region that would otherwise go out. But with all that said and all these nuances, it's often very hard in practice to determine without surveys and a lot of information from all those folks spending money, how they would otherwise spend the money. And again, very tricky to do. So spending from residents within the region of analysis is often easily just put into that economic contribution study bin and not always put into that economic impact analysis bin. Again, there are ways to do that, but that often really increases the level of resources necessary to do, to sort of split that spending out. A final note, I just want to note that in this diagram here, again, with economic contribution sort of being the larger universe and economic impact being a subset of that, I just focused on the direct spending. In both an economic contribution and economic impact analysis, money will then ripple through the regional economy and yield indirect and induced impacts that are associated with the jobs that support that direct spending. And I promise I will introduce those terms in a few slides for those of you that are unfamiliar with indirect and induced. Why am I spending a few slides on benefit cost analysis in an IO or input-output presentation? Well, these worlds often get confused. I read RFPs, I talk to folks, and the terms are intermingled, and often folks that are trying to answer questions aren't quite sure how to make distinctions between a benefit cost analysis and an input-output, or what we talked about earlier, economic contribution and economic impact analysis. So let's try to separate out what a benefit cost analysis is and what that economic impact / contribution analysis is. In that vein, benefit cost analysis is trying to answer the questions, do benefits exceed the costs? In the next slide, we'll go through what benefits are, sort of defining them. But the short of it comes down to whether it's a net positive for society as a whole. Benefit cost analysis can be a positive or negative number, and it can include both market and non-market, so things that do not sort of have a cash flow necessarily associated with it, component. The regulatory world often focuses on benefit cost analysis, where formal EIAs or economic impact analysis are rarely done in regulatory work. I will say that economic contribution / impact analysis, and I'm kind of grouping these together for this because they're very similar and they both use input-output modeling, show the jobs, revenue, and wages generated within a specific region from some sort of investment or activity. This number is always positive. Again, if you have an activity, there's going to be some ripple effect, and has little to do if there is an overall net benefit or cost to society. So in communicating each of these, it's really important to be clear that these types of analyses are answering entirely different questions. Some other notes here, economic impacts are often those headline grabbers. We've created 5,000 jobs or $10 million of output or X number of dollars of salary. And we've certainly seen the change in focus on how maybe favorable economic impact analyses are across administrations over the years. And then finally, just a sort of an example of how these might be used for different audiences. For those of you who know me, know that I'm big into soccer, and many know that I've been running a soccer camp for the past 19 years. In that vein, I've sort of used my economic background to help grow the camp. And what I found is that benefit cost analysis, which includes, again, many non-market benefits, has been a really compelling argument to talk about sort of those benefits to educators, youth soccer programs, or even the parents of the kids going. Where when we've talked to town administration, they've been very interested in the component of the camp where we're creating jobs for students or live within the local economy. We are helping keeping parents at work. We're buying supplies from local, again, suppliers, balls and shirts. So that's been a compelling argument sort of for that group. So again, the audience matters in sort of how you would select one analysis versus the other, or in some cases, like I did with my camp, sort of looking at both components. Just getting into some quick definitions. I'll spend some time on the next slide providing some more concrete examples. So on economic benefit side, this is the impact on social welfare. Economic benefits, as I mentioned earlier, can include both market and non-market, so where money is not exchanging hands values. Economic costs might be monetary payments from one group to another that affect resources available to society and yield net reduction in social welfare. Again, I will provide some concrete examples on the next slides, as I often find those are much more helpful than definitions. Transfer payments are just something that you really don't have to worry about in the IO world so much, but these are just monetary payments from one group to another group that do not affect total resources available to society. And I'll provide a couple examples on the next slide. So again, we're still in the benefit cost analysis world for another slide or two, and then I will hop back to the input-output world, which is the focus of this. Some examples of benefits, sort of the happiness or experience you get out of recreation. It could be improved health and safety protection. It could be a decreased chance of death. It could be an improved experience, a time savings, increase in productivity. Could be more fish, sort of, again, in that sort of more productivity or more product. Lost time and injuries or comorbidities are often examples of a negative benefit. Some agencies we've worked with put those in the cost, but we often, and probably more often, see them as a negative benefit. And then on the cost side, there's the price paid for a regulation action infrastructure program, as well as price paid for employees. On the transfer payment side, an example of this, which doesn't necessarily affect a benefit cost analysis, might be paying money to one business instead of another. So maybe the visitor spending is choosing one versus another. It could be a government stimulus where money is just going from the government to people, but it's just a transfer of money. It's not increasing necessarily welfare from that transfer. So I'm slowly going back into the input-output world after that quick excursion into the benefit cost analysis world. And in doing so, just trying to map an example and tease out some of the different components between the benefit cost analysis world, which are the right and left bottom circles, and sort of that top middle circle, which is your economic impact contribution world. So let's go back to maybe setting up a new National Marine Sanctuary or a National Estuarine Research Reserve as an example. The cost side is a bit clearer. Operational costs are costs in a benefit cost analysis, and they will be in the economic impact or contribution study as long as they're incurring within the study region. So again, that could be your operational costs, employees, and sort of other money you're spending to set up that reserve or maintain that reserve or sanctuary. Then we have the benefit and economic impact contribution side being a bit trickier. So some of you, particularly economists, might be familiar with the travel cost method, which is a revealed preference. So people are actually spending money to sort of reveal what they would pay to capture a benefit like recreation. So in short, what do you pay to get somewhere? And this is a way we sometimes measure benefits in a benefit cost analysis. So in this example, we might have plane and gas costs. So that would be part of, so plane and gas costs would be part of this, as would entry fees and hotel costs. So these are sort of all things that you're paying maybe to get to that reserve or sanctuary and get that benefit. But often much of the plane ticket and some of the gas costs may be spent out of the region. So those would maybe be part of how you calculate that overall benefit, but would not necessarily be part of the economic impact or contribution analysis because that money in many cases is outside of the region. And again, impact contribution are very regionally focused studies. Unless your region, again, is large enough to incorporate that plane or gas spending. Food, supplies, and arguably other activities, while drawn there to that area, the sanctuary or the reserve, might be part of the economic impact or contribution analysis because, again, it's money being spent in the local economy, but not necessarily on the benefit side because often food and supplies are really part of what you pay to get there, and they kind of would fall out of a travel cost model because you would sort of be having that food or supply anyway. It's not really part of getting there. So there are some things that would fall on the impact and contribution side that not necessarily would fall on the benefit side. So again, just wanted to provide this as an example to sort of see some of the more nuanced distinctions. Probably something more of interest for economists, but good to know at a higher level as well. But again, most of the conversation later as we go on will be a little more tailored towards the contract project managers as well. IO modeling, really circling back away from benefit cost analysis there, back to the input-output world, is how economic impact analysis and economic contribution analysis is conducted. So here we have IO modeling. This uses multipliers or numbers that represent sort of that relationship between economic industries and sectors to estimate the direct, indirect, and induced effects of the money rippling through the economy. As promised a few slides ago, I'm going to go over direct, indirect, and induced on the next slides, as well as some of the metrics used. Multipliers are the effect of how every dollar ripples through the economy. So a multiplier might be like 2.5. So for every $1 spent in this region, it might create $2.5 in overall revenue. That's just sort of an example of what a multiplier could be. Or it could be a multiplier for a job. For every X dollars spent in the economy, it creates Y number of jobs, or Z amount of wages. So just a couple definitions on the next few slides. We have direct impacts. So this is production or expenditure changes resulting from a policy. Example here might be visitors spending money at a hotel when they sort of go and visit an area. The indirect impact, which I've now twice introduced without defining. These are exchanges between businesses in the supply chain. So this might be the bedding or food that supplies the hotel. I spend money at the hotel, but that hotel in turn is supporting businesses that are supplying it, often within the region. So those are indirect impacts. And then induced impact are the changes in household spending. So hotel employees, again, I spend money at the hotel is going to pay those hotel employees, which in turn may go spend money at grocery stores, restaurants, gas stations. So they may spend a good amount of their money in the local economy. And these multipliers are what's capturing these indirect and induced impacts along with the direct impact to give you that sort of overall contribution or impact. So what are some of the metrics that we often see in input-output modeling? We typically see sort of that total output, or kind of in more layman's terms, the overall revenue. We might see the value added. This is the difference between total revenue and its expenditures. Sort of maybe a simpler way to think about this might be maybe a car costs $30,000, maybe $15,000. Maybe the cost was $15,000 for supplies and other parts. Maybe that those folks sort of selling the car also put $5,000 of labor in. So there's that $10,000 value added between the $20,000 in supply and labor and $30,000 in supplies. So that, again, there was that $10,000 value added there. Then we have earnings, which are the household wages essentially, and the jobs, often put in full-time equivalent of jobs. So that's, again, right around 2,080 hours a year. So that part-time jobs are sort of aggregated in that sense together and produced as full-time equivalents in many of these IO models. So I'm just going to preface this that we're going to talk about 3 different model types in a little bit of detail. I'm going to move from the simplest, so the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA's, RIMS multipliers, to some more complex examples with IMPLAN, and then finally REMI. And as Jennifer noted, there's going to be some, it sounds like IMPLAN and REMI are sort of one of the upcoming webinars, and certainly in the past weeks we heard a little bit more from BEA about their input-output world, and that's sort of where the RIMS multipliers come from. I'll finish with a comparison slide of the 3 models. And that slide breaks all sorts of PowerPoint presentation rules, but I have a slide to go along with it, which is a little bit more of a brief example of the key takeaways. And then finally, we have the, again, finally, I'm going to go through about 6 examples of different projects very quickly and why we chose the input-output tool that we did. So one example of a project was with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, and looking at the economic impacts, contribution of resilience grants. So the tool that we selected here were the RIMS2 multipliers. Our data inputs we had were sort of spending on grants within a region. And our study area that we ultimately selected here were state level impacts. And why did we do this? Well, in this particular project, we were looking at grants that crossed a number, or that were part of a number of different states. So something like IMPLAN, you're essentially purchasing each one at the state level. So I can purchase a New Hampshire one, I can purchase a Florida one, I can purchase a California one. And as I will show in that slide that breaks all sorts of PowerPoint rules, that's quite expensive, often around $8,000 per state, or about half of that as you add more states on. But the RIMS2 multipliers are quite nice because you can, for example, buy all the multipliers for a given NAICS code, sort of that North American Industrial Classification System code. So at an industry level or an aggregated industry level, for just a couple $100 for every single state. So when I buy an industry, I get the multipliers for every single state. So we found in this one that we had a few industries that were often involved or associated with that grant spending, and we were able to purchase those and get the results we needed by state at a cost effectively. And here we didn't really need those outputs by industry. I will talk about IMPLAN shortly, but RIMS2 multipliers sort of give you an overall result for those metrics we just talked about: wages, revenue, jobs for that region. But it does not break it down by what's happening in each industry. And I'll go over that as we go through IMPLAN. Just a quick view here in that teal color, sort of these columns H, I, J, K. Those are just examples of what multipliers are. And you would essentially multiply those multipliers by some sort of investment for a given industry. And that's ultimately how you determine the sort of that economic impact or contribution, depending on what you're looking at. ERG also did a project for EPA's landfill methane outreach program. We also used RIMS-2 data for this. Our data inputs for this, there was capital costs, there were labor costs, and maintenance costs. And our study area, we wanted to look at outputs for any particular state where somebody was interested in putting in sort of a gas to energy project. So here we decided on RIMS-2 largely in part because we needed to embed this into a user calculator. It's much more complicated to use IMPLAN. You can get the multipliers for that, but you wouldn't necessarily pay that entire cost from IMPLAN just to get the multipliers. So we wanted to get the multipliers, and then the user could go in and put in their spending on a project, and essentially we could calculate out what the economic impact would be for their particular state. So sort of that ability to put it and embed it in a calculator for the general public is something that can be really appealing when you're using those RIMS-2 multipliers. So again, you'll sort of see the top part of this screen where we had different states listed. We had multipliers for various industries, household spending, wholesale trade, air and gas compressor manufacturing. This was all embedded into a calculator. And ultimately, what came out are sort of the bottom half of these two slides where we have total economic impacts, and we could sort of get the number of jobs created, 38.3 in that bottom left, the statewide earnings, in 3.1 million, and then the statewide economic output resulting from the ripple effect, about 6.4 million. And we did that for the construction phase and operating phase. So we really separated out our multipliers so that we could look at when the project's going on and when it's in sort of maintenance phase and just continuing to provide energy and being maintained over time. So I'm going to jump from RIMS to IMPLAN, which is sort of, I'd say sort of the middle of the road in terms of complexity and cost. So we did a project with the National Estuarine Research Reserves. We did an economic contribution analysis. And here, our data inputs were operations spending. We looked at visitor spending, and we looked at partner of the reserve spending. So these were sort of three components of spending that in some cases, that are all certainly associated with the reserve, and in many cases were impacts that may or may not happen without the reserve in place. For this particular study, we didn't try to separate out impacts and contribution. We just focused on overall economic contribution. Our study area here was variable depending on the reserve. We really focused on where employees lived and where the majority of the spending occurred. We also talked to folks about what would resonate in terms of how we frame the results. Do we want state level outputs? Do we want to look at just a couple of geographies? And that geographic flexibility was one of the reasons we wanted to select IMPLAN here. So with IMPLAN, again, you buy a state, or they actually do also have a national, you can buy a national product where you have access to all the states, which again is much more from a cost perspective, but if you're doing a lot of analyses across the states, it can make a lot of sense. And in purchasing a state here, we can then do as many analyses as we want for any combination of counties within that state. So we wanted to look at just the county that the reserve was in. We wanted to look at the county plus some neighboring counties where a lot of folks might work and a lot of supplies might come from. We also wanted to look at the state level. So because we wanted to look at a lot of different combinations, this did make some sense from a cost perspective, because when you buy multipliers from the RIMS 2, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, you get, you can buy, again, a state level multiplier where you get all of the different industries, but again, that's only at the state level. You could buy multipliers for a specific county, and you could get multipliers for every single industry. But again, what if we want to look at 2 or 3 counties? So we would just be purchasing multiple sets of multipliers to kind of look at the geographic flexibility we would need there. Also important in this analysis is we wanted to understand the output by industry. So as I mentioned with the RIMS 2 multipliers, you just see the overall impact for a region. It doesn't say how much is going to maybe hotels, restaurants, and sort of other industries, gas stations, where IMPLAN will estimate those outputs by industry. And there can often be a story to tell that is associated with those outputs if you're trying to maybe build some support across some of those industries that might really benefit from a particular project. So again, something we really wanted to be look at here. Certainly consistency with other NOAA programs, fisheries and sanctuaries, and again, similar studies from non-NOAA entities such as the National Park Service have sort of used IMPLAN for similar types of analyses. So there was a lot of reasons we wanted to use IMPLAN for this particular analysis. Similarly, more quickly, we also used IMPLAN for San Joaquin Valley of Economic, where we did an economic impact analysis for the California Air Resource Board. And here, we wanted to understand tax impacts, which are not part of RIMS. We wanted to, just like the NERS project I brought up, we wanted to understand the impact on specific industries. And finally, while they would have loved to use REMI, which I'll go over in the next slide, to understand year-by-year impacts, cost is a big difference when you go from IMPLAN to REMI, and I will show that on the slide that breaks all the PowerPoint rules. So REMI will give you impacts year to year to year, whereas IMPLAN and BEA RIMS 2 give you an kind of an overall impact that happens, but there's less focus on exactly when that impact happens. It's going to happen. It might be over sort of few months, few years. It sort of leaves that component of it a little bit vague. But again, that's sort of the total impact you're going to have. So kind of staying on that point and moving to REMI. So ERG for the State of Maine's Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, GOPIF, did some economic impact analysis and benefit cost analysis as well in support of their climate action plan that came out in December of 2020. For this, for the component of this work that we looked at input-output modeling, we used REMI because the climate action plan really wanted to look at impacts annually through 2050, and that was a really important component of this. So our data inputs here, we had sort of direct losses by year for industries. We looked at flooding, sea level rise, and sort of simulations of storms over the year. So again, if a hurricane hits in 2037, what happens? Sea level rise in 2050, what businesses are flooded? And then we can input those losses into REMI to sort of see the overall effect. We looked at potential of losing lobster industry because of ocean acidification and warming. We looked at, on sort of that greenhouse gas mitigation side, we looked at fuel switches for emission reductions. We looked at tourism impacts. So as those might go down or maybe up, how does that impact the rest of the economy? And then looking at it by year. So why did we choose this? Again, that impact over time was very important. Also here, the socioeconomic impacts were important. So sort of that migration population movement. REMI really does look at how does those economic impacts tie into some of the other sort of sort of that of the socioeconomic composition, what happens with demographics, what happens with household income, what happens with population movement. Those are some things that REMI can help answer, that Maine was quite interested in over time as well. So that's, again, why we use REMI here. And just this, again, basic example where in this bottom table, we sort of looked at what the percent drop might be, and we could sort of look at the year by year impact on, here was agricultural related jobs. This sort of graph in the top right just sort of showed what REMI showed when we had maybe storms come for various years, just looking at the different scenarios for flooding. So it gives you these outputs where you can sort of really see that those results over time, and that's sort of the takeaway of the slide, is you can sort of see those annual values. So before I get to the slide that breaks all the rules, I just wanted to provide a few quick takeaways on when to use each model. REMI, if you need to see those year-to-year impacts, they typically kind of go, a lot of their models go through 2060 now. If you need to see those socioeconomic impacts, like migration, household income, some of those that I had just shown 2 slides ago, other demographic information, REMI is the only model that's going to do that of the 3 we discussed today. IMPLAN will provide you those outputs by industry. Again, as does REMI. It also does tax impacts, as does REMI, but it's often for about 10%, 20% of the cost, depending on your REMI model, maybe 30% of the cost. And again, it has many of the benefits we talked about with that geographic flexibility, in sort of looking at the different impacts by region within a state. And then BEA RIMS 2, when do you use that? Well, when cost is a major driver, that can be a nice tool. We're talking several hundred as opposed to 4,000 to 8,000, as opposed to 30,000 to 100,000 with REMI. And RIMS 2 is very nice when you're trying to embed multipliers into tools that you want folks to use. You can put those multipliers in, they're there, and it can sort of be a nice way to, again, develop tools that other folks can use outside of the model itself, where IMPLAN and REMI are very much, you're using it at your desktop. You might have a license for one or a few people to use it. It's not something that the general public can really use. So here's the awful slide. The only thing I want folks to take away here, if you want a screenshot of it, feel free to do it. 2, I just mentioned in that far right corner, just for contextual awareness, there is a model that EPA has called SAGE. It's also dynamic, like REMI. It's free, and EPA uses it for some of their analyses. But the limiting factor here for use across a lot of projects is that this is just broken into 9 regions across the United States. So they're very large regions that typically hasn't been as applicable for work we've done for NOAA and the state and local level, or applicable at all. But it's there, just something I want to make folks aware of. Also, the sectors. So RIMS 2 and IMPLAN have a lot more industrial detail in terms of our inputs in particular. So if you want to more specifically say that there was $20 million in an industry, again, we're getting at the more granular level of putting that in. So it's a little more sensitive in terms of the outputs based on the industry it goes in. REMI is a little bit broader, where you can get 2370 or 160 industries as inputs, or you can input values into those. And that really drives the cost if you want those 2370 or 160 to sort of lower to upper end values. And then the cost, again, REMI varies dramatically. It can be very customized. It can be a great tool, but as you start adding more counties within a state, if you want to look at geographic impacts on regions within a state, it really drives the cost way up as you want to look and have more granularity in those industries. Going from 23 to 160 is very much going to drive the cost up as well. So we're talking tens of thousands for REMI. We're talking about 4,000 to 8,000. 8,000 if you're doing one state for IMPLAN, 4,000 if you're doing sort of getting multiple states on top of that. And with RIMS 2, last I looked, it was $75 for an industry. So that would be, I want the multipliers for maybe hotels or something like that. And you would get that for all the states. Or you can select a region, maybe it's a county, a group of counties, a state, and you would get all the industrial multipliers for that region for 275. Final slide here, just on selecting a study area. I said I'd talk about this just a little bit. This is a very challenging decision that many folks try to take on when doing input-output modeling. Do I use just the county that this is occurring in? Do I look at multiple counties in and surrounding the area that maybe a project's in? Do I look at the entire state? And I would say there's not necessarily any right answer here, but there are some things to consider. One, sort of that intrinsic connection in proximity. And what I mean there is where are your workers coming from? Where are you spending money? Where do you have a strong story to tell? We're doing a lot of direct spending in areas X, Y, and Z, and they really make sense to be part of this. The second part of this is the interconnection of the economy. And what I mean by that is I might be buying a boat from county X, and county Z might be, my direct spending might have nothing to do with county Z, but perhaps county Z is supplying all the inputs to that maybe boat making facility or boat repair, whatever it might be. So there's sort of, when in understanding the ripple effect of the economy, you might want to consider, is there anything to consider on how everything is interconnected in terms of that ripple effect? Because maybe we don't want to cut out a county if it's a major supplier of something you're purchasing from. So sort of thinking about those regions in terms of their interconnectedness. And then finally, audience. Are we trying to tell something to a state level politician? In which case, it really might make sense to just provide these at the state level. Are we trying to talk to folks in a certain county? And often we go down as low as the county level. And if that's the case, we might want to provide some outputs at the county or sort of smaller scale area. The big trade-off we do, so why not always do the larger area? As we create a larger area, typically our numbers go up. But what's more impressive, $100 million in a state, or 90 million within a particular county? And that might depend on the audience. we sort of dilute that over a value over a larger area if we make the study area much larger. So again, things that we've certainly run across. So with that, I am done, and we can open up, Katie, to questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Charles. That was a little over my head, but I think you hit the right audience. So we do have a few questions. I'm going to grab the first one. And while everyone is thinking of their questions and typing them in the chat, this first question is it a correct interpretation that certain costs, for example, operational costs, will be a negative in BCA, but show up as a positive impact?
Absolutely, 100%. So an example would just be often paying employees, or purchasing equipment. That's often the cost of doing some sort of activity, but it helps the economy in the sense that you're then in the benefit cost analysis, it would be negative. But in terms of the economic contribution or impact analysis, that is money that's now going to folks or to equipment that then ripples through the economy. So for an economic contribution or impact analysis, that's going to show up. And that's, again, why they answer very different questions in these two types of analyses.
Great, thank you. Next question. So when IO estimates the number of jobs created in a new project, do they net out the number of jobs that won't be created elsewhere in the economy because of the new jobs created?
Not necessarily. So an IO model will sort of take the baseline as doing nothing. So I guess one interpretation is, do we spend money on a sanctuary or something else, development or something? So we're not necessarily looking at the alternative cases here, and netting this out. We're really just looking at what will happen from that incremental spending, in sort of that additional incremental spending. So folks have done sort of more complex analyses where they try to sort of, maybe if we spend more in one area, we can put that in as a positive. And then if we're taking away money from something else, you can put that in as a negative, somewhere else and sort of do that. But you sort of have to develop that carefully yourself in terms of what those assumptions might be.
Thanks. As a follow-up to IO, talking about IOs, are the various IO models equally good for cross-sectional and dynamic analyses?
In terms of dynamic, no. So REMI is really your only option if you really want to look at impact by year. It's the only one that looks at sort of how spending will generate new spending over time and sort of look at that temporal or time-based focus. Cross-sectionally, there are some disadvantages to REMI because it's a little broader, not quite as granular, as sort of RIMS 2, or IMPLAN in terms of your data inputs. But in terms of your outputs, IMPLAN's very nice because you get those results by industry at a pretty granular level. So that sort of provides some, I guess, advantages from a cross-sectional standpoint. Yeah.
Thanks. Can IMPLAN and REMI be customized like changing multipliers?
So yes, I think REMI, you typically will work with REMI itself because they'd sort of custom make your model, and something I didn't say is that often takes several weeks to months to create. So that's really important for understanding timing. So you'll often work with REMI to customize it yourself exactly how you need it. Do you need tax impacts? Do you not? Because you don't want to ask for more than you need with REMI. It drives the price up. Folks have a lot of folks typically just use IMPLAN as is. It's sort of it can be a desktop or cloud-based. You can either download it or sort of use it online, and it's really moving more towards an online platform. But folks have, I know, we haven't necessarily done this recently, but folks have sort of tried to multiply IMPLAN on the back end, I believe, in other instances when they really need to. So I think there is some things you can do with IMPLAN, but this all changes a bit depending on if you're using the online or desktop version.
Thanks. Okay, next question. Can you talk about the dynamics in the REMI model? Is this a CGE model, or is it just make assumptions about how multipliers may change over time?
I would say it's more in line with a CGE model from my understanding, and hopefully that's something that one of these future webinars will kind of go more into the maybe details of REMI itself. But it really does look at if you have an economic impact that might increase, or you spend in one area, maybe that increases household spending in or household income in one year, and then they might spend more in other industries in sort of the next year. And it sort of looks at how things might stabilize, but then also ripple off of each other over time. So I'd say it's more in line with a CGE type model from my understanding.
Great, thanks. So let's grab one last question. Can EIA be used to demonstrate additionality? For example, the claim that a project would not have been done without a specified level of support or offset.
Gosh, I'm not 100% sure I follow.
I put that in your chat.
Okay, let me see.
Charles, if you want to read the question as well.
Demonstrate the claim that a project would not have been done.
And if the asker of that question wants to send in any kind of clarifying language, that might be helpful.
Yeah, that would be helpful in that one. I'm not quite sure I fully follow.
That's okay. We might take that one offline then. Okay. Since we are almost at time, my last question will be, is a copy of the presentation available? So Charles, would you make this slide deck available for those who attended today?
Absolutely. I can make that available. I can send it to you afterwards, Katie.
Yep. Okay, yes, Charles will send that to me. And if you would like a copy of this, please send a quick email to library.seminars, that's an S on the end of that, at NOAA.gov. I put that in the chat for everyone, and I will get those sent out when I have those slides. That is the end of my questions. Jennifer, would you like to remind everyone of the 2 upcoming seminars before we close?
Yeah, sure. We have contacted the REMI representatives and the IMPLAN folks to give us some more hands-on demos of their model, and there are also a seminar set up to share some input-output modeling experience on the fisheries issues next month, end of the next month. So stay tuned, we'll send out notice emails.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for listening in. If we didn't get to your question, we will pass those on to the speaker. But as a reminder, we recorded this. If you missed it or would like to rewatch it, share it with a colleague. It'll be on the library's YouTube channel shortly. And with that, thank you all so much for joining today. I hope you have a safe and wonderful rest of your Monday.